I'm going to do a sound check. Governor, can you hear us okay?
Yep, I can hear you just fine.
Hear you. Thank you for joining us. I understand you got more snow in Denver than we've got here.
It's still snowing.
Well, in our business, we don't complain about the snow.
No, none of us should complain about the snow. So happy to be joining.
For being here. Bill Ritter has been governor. In fact, I represented him on Colorado River negotiations when I was at CWCB. He's the founder and director of the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University. And I thought it'd be very interesting for you to hear his leadership challenges. So Governor, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's great to be there, and sorry I couldn't be there in person, but as I was saying before in the chat here, it's better to be, I think, safe than sorry, and just traveling the I-25 corridor on a snowy day is not much fun. So how much time do we have again?
We have about an hour.
So I'll try and keep track of this, but I'm probably going to talk for 20 or 25 minutes and then go to questions and fill in if there aren't sufficient questions. But yeah, let me sort of talk first just about what I consider to be a 35,000-foot view of the water situation in Colorado and give people a sense of what you're dealing with when you're in a leadership position at the statewide level and water issues come along. We are a headwater state, as almost all of you probably know. There's only one river that enters Colorado, and it flows back out 23 miles later. Anybody know what that river is?
Green River? Green?
It's the Green. It's the only river that enters Colorado and flows back out. All other rivers flow out of the state. So we have 8 significant basins: the North Platte, the South Platte, the Republican, the Arkansas, the Rio Grande, the San Juan, the Colorado, and the Yampa. And we have compacts on all of those basins for delivery of certain quantities of water to our neighboring states. In like the Republican River, we actually have a compact, not just with Kansas, because it flows into Kansas, but it also flows through Nebraska and back down into Kansas. So the compact is trilateral. It's Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado. We have, compacts. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit about the Colorado River, which is in dire straits, but that's 7 states, 4 that are considered upper basin, 3 that are considered lower basin, and the compact was struck in 1922, and with a misguided notion that there was more river in the Colorado River, and really it's the Colorado and the Green River combined. There was just an idea that there's more water than there really was, so the compact overcommitted the upper basin states in delivering water. It's been a problem ever since, but that problem now has been exacerbated by a mega drought in the West. So as governor, you're constantly having to think about ensuring that you avoid litigation and that you're delivering water to your neighboring states under the compacts. It's telling that every time we've been sued under a compact in Colorado, we've lost. So a headwater state who does not, make their commitment in a compact doesn't have much to stand on. The Republican River was a pretty interesting thing for us to have done when I was governor, because it is clear we were not meeting our obligation to Nebraska and Kansas. We were very close to getting sued by the state of Kansas, but the Attorney General was involved in some kind of a scandal of the Attorney General of Kansas right before they're going to file a lawsuit, and he left office. And because he left office, it gave us a reprieve from the litigation. And so what we did was get money from the Colorado Water Conservation Board. We shut down Bonnie Reservoir out on the Eastern Plains that many of you may know, because there's so much of Bonnie we were losing, and we shut it down altogether and then built a pipeline so that evaporation would not affect the Republican River and dry it any further. There's evaporation both at Bonnie and along the river. And so we built a pipeline, millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars to build that pipeline and to ensure delivery of what we were required to deliver under the compact. I don't know how much you've paid attention to this, but last year, Nebraska, we also have a compact on the South Platte River. It's with the state of Nebraska, and the Nebraska legislature passed legislation and authorized money for the state of Nebraska to come in and build a pipeline from inside of Colorado, way inside of Colorado, on the South Platte River, so that they could ensure they were getting their water delivery on the South Platte from the state of Colorado. That's going to go to litigation. I think it could be one of the pieces of litigation we ultimately could win. I don't see Nebraska winning that, but that's, so you're dealing with these compacts. And in the case of the Colorado River Compact, it's not just the upper and lower basin states. There's also an international compact that governs what Mexico should get on the Colorado River. Again, we're gonna go back to that. So, but you have that, as part of what you have to think about and you have to be challenged by. One of the other things that happened while I was governor, and it still stands today, of course, we have in our Constitution the doctrine of prior appropriations. So you register, you get a permit to have a certain amount of water, and you're permitted that amount in a senior versus junior appropriation mechanism. It says if there's a senior appropriator that cannot get all of the water that they have dedicated to them, then a junior appropriator may actually get a call on their water and lose their water. That's how the doctrine of prior appropriations work. And there's been a lot of litigation about this. There was sort of a doctrine that we've tried to undo over the years called use it or lose it, so that it wouldn't create particularly in the agricultural sector, sort of a mentality that was wasteful, where they were using water just so they didn't lose their right, but instead try to find ways for there to be sharing of water. And especially when a farmer has land lying fallow, they can share that water with municipalities. They can combine sort of in a co-op fashion, variety of them, put their water rights all together and share in that fashion. But certainly the prior appropriations doctrine, which dates back to the date of our Constitution, it is sort of, I would say, arcane in modern day. It's a pretty difficult thing to utilize the prior appropriations doctrine at a time where there are multiple uses that the water is being put to, and in a time of great drought. We are in a mega drought, as I said before, and that makes the prior appropriations doctrine kind of even more difficult to work with. Important case, Supreme Court case that happened in 2004 in Colorado. There were several people who had wells on the South Platte River. They were farmers, and they were irrigating with those wells. They did not have them permitted in the prior appropriations system. So what happened is the senior appropriators sued those people who had wells, the farmers who had wells, and it went into water court. And there were hydrologists who came in and testified, said, hey, listen, well, that's the other thing we have in Colorado is a water court that litigates, water rights among appropriated users. But they said, the hydrologist said that the well use was impacting the amount of water flowing in the South Platte River, and hence it was impacting what senior appropriators had a right to use. The court, I forget what the lower court did and how that went up, but the Supreme Court basically said that the senior appropriators made their case, and that if the junior well users were going to continue to use that water, they had to, first of all, permit their wells. They had to get them permitted in the prior appropriations system. And secondly, if they wanted to continue to use and they were impacting senior users, they had to augment the flow of that by buying water from some of the user and bringing it into that South Platte Basin. So that was kind of a shock to a lot of people in the farming community. And I think there was a great deal of nervousness about, the hydrology of rivers being impacted by wells that were 3 or 4 miles away. The other thing that we've had to deal with is the buying of water rights, which we make it possible for people who have appropriated rights to sell those rights. So it really started more than anywhere else in the Arkansas River Valley in the 1970s. I don't know how many of you know, a community down there. It's Otero County. I forget now if it's Ordway is the capital of Otero County, but it was really Otero and Crowley were the first couple of counties where municipalities that were developing at the time, let's take Aurora as an example, went into the Arkansas River community and said, well, you have this water, we would like to buy up your water rights out of the Arkansas River. We'll pick them up somewhere upstream and pipe them to Aurora. And they said yes, and they did that. And basically over time, we dried up Crowley County. We dried up a good portion of Otero and a lot of other places along the Arkansas River, but we have not restricted ourselves in the buying and selling of water to just those southeastern Colorado counties. I remember when I was running for governor, I met a person who was a farmer, and he had sold the water rights off of his farm in Washington County. I think it was, again, the Republican River. And the value of his land decreased by 90%. So the water was very lucrative, right? That water was lucrative for a farmer who makes a pretty thin margin, pretty thin profit margin. And he sold it, and it was really, in a sense, to save the land. But in saving the land, he was no longer able to irrigate, and he really made it more difficult to earn any kind of a profit as a farmer. And certainly to alienate the land after you've already sold the water rights off of it can be very difficult, and you lose a lot of money doing that in the process. So we have, again, the prior appropriations doctrine that allows you to buy and sell, but you're always, if people are in the business of buying and selling water, they want to make sure that they're thinking about how they buy a water right that has a senior appropriation on it, or, if you're a farmer impacting the flow of the river and you have to augment the flow of the river so that you're not depriving senior appropriators of water, then you have to go in and figure out as well how to get water that's appropriated at a senior level and augment the flow with that. So that's a big part of it. I mentioned the 8 rivers that flow out of Colorado. So we have 8 river basins, and then the city and county of Denver, the kind of the municipal water supply in the Denver metropolitan area, it's its own basin. So we have 9 what we consider to be basins, and my predecessor, Governor Owens, established a roundtable for those basins so that people would meet in their basins, but then there was a mechanism for the roundtables to talk together about different things that would allow them either to share water or to think about how to move water. It was interesting. I was talking to a person running for Congress, and we were talking about water. And I said, well, you do understand trans-basin diversions, right? And that person said, no, I actually don't know what a trans-basin diversion is. Something we have in Colorado is, and this is why the Colorado River is such a scary prospect if, in fact, we get to a place of the federal government really limiting the amount of water that we're able to utilize out of the Colorado River. We have trans-basin diversions that bring water from the Colorado River basin over to the Front Range. So the Continental Divide runs along there. Water that runs in the western slope runs into rivers or tributaries of rivers that ultimately become the Colorado River basin. If you transfer it over to this side, into the eastern plains or into the Front Range, then you have transferred it out of the Colorado River basin, and you've transferred it into a basin that's now the Platte River Basin and the Platte, and it could be actually not just the Platte River because it's also the Arkansas, but both the Arkansas, the Platte, where, the South Platte, it joins the North Platte at Platte, Nebraska, flows into the Missouri flows into the Mississippi flows into the Gulf of Mexico. The Arkansas leaves Leadville, Colorado, where its headwaters are, and flows all the way to the Mississippi River, I think around Memphis, Tennessee. So it also goes into the Gulf. So you're really transferring water from one basin to another. And we have several of these diversions that take it out of one and into another. And so on the Front Range, take just the I-25 corridor and you go 30 miles either way from the I-25 corridor, about 85% of all Coloradans live in that corridor. Well, that's all on the Front Range. The other 15% live in counties outside of the 11 counties. And actually, I should include Mesas in that 85%. It's not on the Front Range, but it's small relative to many of the other Front Range counties. But anyway, there's just a big population of people. I think it's something like 80% of the people in Colorado live in that corridor on I-25. And so we have made a practice of bringing water from the Colorado River Basin in trans-basin diversions across the mountains and into the Front Range. I don't know how many of you remember Amendment A. It was on the ballot in 2004, and it was an amendment that was looking at bringing even more water from the western slope to the eastern plains. And interestingly, the people of Colorado, even though the largest part of the population lives on the eastern plain or the Front Range, the people of Colorado turned that down. And so we, have had some basins. I'm trying to think if we've had any basin built since. I think we had some projects that were already scheduled to be built that may have been concluded since 2004. But we bring a lot of water across here. So let's just talk about the Colorado River. As I said, it was a compact. It was set in 1922. And the first thing my director of natural resources told me when I was governor is we never want to go into litigation on the Colorado River, as we'd been in litigation, on the Arkansas, the Republican, probably looking at litigation on the Platte River at some point in time soon. But he said on the Colorado, you don't want to go into litigation because we are the headwater state, and they overestimated the amount of water when we struck that compact. So the upper basin states are Wyoming, because it has the green that is part of the Colorado River Compact, and Utah, because it has both the green and the Colorado, which has the Colorado, and then New Mexico, which has the San Juan River that actually originates in Colorado, but it flows through the northwestern part of New Mexico and ultimately flows through Arizona and no, it's not Arizona, it's Utah, and then into the Colorado River. So we're the upper basin states. The lower basin states are Arizona, Nevada, and California. And there's a couple of parts about those states. If you think about, and you may or may not know how Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Phoenix, how they all looked in 1922, there probably wasn't a great deal of thought given to the kind of explosive growth that they would experience in the water use. That's just one part of it. The bigger part of it is probably what an agricultural belt the Imperial Valley is in California, and the number of people that it feeds, and what a breadbasket it is for the nation and actually globally. And so here we're faced with a mega drought on the Colorado, and we are looking at how we manage, just a little bit of water. Compounding the difficulties that I've talked about in terms of, cities that have grown and the agricultural use, is that both Lake Powell and Lake Mead have hydropower. And at a certain point, the water in those two reservoirs can become so low that you no longer are able to generate electricity from the reservoirs because of where it is. It's called I think it's called the dead pool zone. And it's millions and millions of people who rely upon energy generated. The second part of it is it's all carbon free. So at a time where we're worrying a great deal about CO2 and trying to shut down coal around the country, limit the build out of natural gas around the country because of climate change, we could lose these major generators that are actually generating electricity, but doing it in a way that doesn't generate CO2, that doesn't generate NOx or SOx or the other kind of greenhouse gas pollutants. So we're in dire straits on the Colorado. The current status is that the lower basin states and the upper basin states were to kind of go into their own corners and to look at, okay, how much can the upper basin how much can we deliver? What kinds of things can we do to up our delivery? And then the lower basin states had to ask the question, what can we do to conserve? And there's been a couple years now. It'd be fair to say that there have been attempts that have been made. Most recently, the lower basin states had something that they wanted to submit, that they had to submit by the deadline, but only Nevada and Arizona signed off on it. California did not sign off. The upper basin states have put a plan together, but if that plan is rejected, then the state of Colorado will be at the mercy of the federal government and the Bureau of Reclamation, which will be sort of the deciding judge of how much water we're going to be required to deliver. I don't know if you've been in the area where the Gunnison River flows. There are three rivers that form the Gunnison River up by Crested Butte and Alma, and then the Gunnison flows down past Gunnison, takes a right turn west, and flows into the Black Canyon. Before it goes there, we built a reservoir called the Blue Mesa Reservoir that has more mileage, linear mileage along the shore than any other reservoir in Colorado. It's a massive, massive reservoir. This past summer, there was only one marina where you could dock your boat on this massive reservoir because of the level of the Blue Mesa. And what had happened is the water managers for the Colorado River, that included, people from Colorado that are trying to protect our best interests, decided that we would utilize water from the Blue Mesa, from the Flaming Gorge that's up in partly in Wyoming, partly in Utah. So the Flaming Gorge, the Blue Mesa, and the Navajo Dam, which is in New Mexico, would be the places where we would try and bring water in order to put enough there to meet our obligation of what the headwater states must do, the upper basin states must do in order to deliver on the compact. Compact is going to be renegotiated in 25 or 26. We look to be in a pretty difficult position of getting the states to agree at how the upper basin states will deliver and how the lower basin states will conserve, just based upon the last 2 years and the inability, I would say. And really, even when Governor Polis was elected, I was the person who was kind of the go-between between the negotiators on that compact and Governor Polis's new administration. And these are difficult conversations. There may be some things ultimately that will have to be done by members of Congress, but you can imagine with 7 states like that, there may not be a meeting of the minds because the interests and how to use that water, where to use that water, and the consequences of not having enough water are really sort of disparate interests. So a couple other things, and I'm gonna stop talking. You should know that we do have a water plan in Colorado. It was put together during Governor Hickenlooper's administration. What happened was Governor Owens formed the Basin Roundtable. I funded the Basin Roundtable and then we had a water czar that kept that conversation together, and we actually were very well served by the people in my administration to try and get the Basin Roundtable to collaborate. Governor Hickenlooper actually wrote a plan, but the plan looks a lot like what other governors had always said about water. You've got to conserve as much as you can. We have to utilize both conventional and even unconventional storage. So unconventional storage is you pump water in high water years, you pump it back into the ground, back into the aquifers, and it's not necessarily what we call conventional storage because it's not a dam or a reservoir, but it's underground water. And so it also relies upon what I would call grassroots planning. And that's really the Basin Roundtable is to have people from, communities that are part of that and that are helping plan based upon the interest of their communities. And so, that's a big part of it. The plan looks at risks. It looks at and the risk, particularly in our case, I think the chief risk is climate change because climate change relates as well to precipitation. It relates to these long droughts, this drought we're in, and it relates to wildfires. And wildfires can have a real impact on the health of a watershed. Just we saw it in several different ways, but if you remember the 2002 Hayman fire, when so the first of all the trees burn and they really decertified all of the area that was, the soil around those because they burned so hot. But trees are a real erosion protection. And when the trees burn, we lost our erosion protection. You add to that you fight those fires with bentonite clay. At the time, it was the second biggest fire in the history of the state. We used a lot of clay to fight that. And so it really ruined the South Platte, ruined it as a fishery for a good part of the South Platte. And it's, now back, but that's 20 years later. And so water management and with wildfires, there's a real relationship between that. And so we have to understand that climate change, because it impacts precipitation, drought, and wildfires, it is really the chief risk to the state of Colorado and our ability to have sufficient water and to have the ability to meet the different compacts that we have on all of the river systems around the state. We try and manage that in part by the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And I think that's my friend from Occidental who's still there, right? Is that you, Eric? And so I heard your presentation. Thank you, Eric, for that. But people should know that oil and gas in Colorado, I know it's a small bit of the usage for fracking, but the severance tax for oil and gas goes into a pot of money, and that pot of money is divvied up. The Department of Natural Resources takes half of the severance tax. The Department of Local Affairs takes half of the severance taxes. And in the Department of Natural Resources, half of the half, so a full quarter, and this is hundreds of millions of dollars, goes to the Colorado Water Conservation Board to try and manage water projects in a way that allows people to be able to keep using safe and reliable supplies of water. So that is a state agency under the Department of Natural Resources. And, because of our severance taxes, we have had significant amounts of money that we can spend to do, hopefully, conservation-minded things. I mentioned before, the Republican River solution was by piping it along the Republican River instead of letting it run in a bed and evaporate in a significant way. That was all funded by the Colorado Water Conservation Board. So for people who are really water acolytes in the state of Colorado, knowing about the Colorado Water Conservation Board is fairly significant. But what we also know is that municipalities do a great deal to try and manage water as well. And if you've seen the news, I think this is all a Northern Colorado group, but Aurora City Council, because they have their own municipal water supply, Aurora City Council is talking about imposing limits on the amount of irrigation you can do for a residential home. You can only grow so much grass, and only a certain amount of it can be grass that needs to be irrigated if you're building a new home. So a new build out. I actually am one of 12 kids. A big part of my family lives out in the area that's sort of east of Aurora. East of Aurora when we were growing up, but part of Aurora now. One of my sisters, she lives on a plot of land, probably about 10 acres, and the aquifer beneath them they're not on Aurora's water system. They're on a well system, but they've lost 40 feet in that aquifer in the last decade. So Aurora, because they're pulling from the same aquifer, is looking at putting them on the Aurora water supply system. And those are the kinds of measures that I think we're going to see. I'm pretty good friends with Jim Lockhead, who's the head of Denver Water. And Jim Lockhead will assure people that we will be managing water differently in the coming decades. And the Denver Water Board is kind of the biggest water buffalo in the state. We used to call them the water buffaloes. And, they deliver water not just to Denver customers, but to other areas in the metropolitan area. But they know that they're going to have to impose greater restrictions, in spite of the fact that ag users are such a big part of the use. We still will look to residential use and to conservation and residential use. So I think, in the next 15 to 20, 25 years, you're going to see a much greater restriction around irrigating lawns. Look out for different policies coming our way that will probably look to xeriscaping or zero water usage on lawns in an effort to try and be part of the conservation effort. I'd say the big part of this is going to come in 25 and 26 when we negotiate the Colorado Water Compact, but it could be before that as well, just because of the kind of growth we could see even in the next few years and the attention that municipalities and counties are beginning to pay to it. Arapahoe County, my mother lived out in Strasburg, which is in Adams County, Colorado, about probably 10 or 15 miles, more than that, from Aurora. I don't really know if I know how far it is from Aurora, but anyway, it was Adams County, and Adams County had a restriction that you could not plan a development unless you had a 300-year water plan for that development. Arapahoe had never passed that. It's a more conservative community, more conservative group of county commissioners, and I think, less inclined to issue those kinds of mandates. And then they looked at the situation they're in, and they're now studying that, and they'll pass it. They will pass a mandate that will require a 300-year water plan in order for any new development to be developed. And that's sort of the place we are in Colorado for residential development. I think it's the place we'll find ourselves where irrigation for commercial and residential buildings are concerned. And at the same time, there are going to be all sorts of solutions that people will seek that hopefully will impact the ability in the agricultural sector to also conserve. So I said I was only going to talk a half hour, but I'm a trial lawyer by birth, and I always talk longer than I said I was. Sorry about that, but go ahead now.
Well, Governor Ritter, thank you so much. I'm always amazed at how up to date you are on water issues. It's obvious that you keep track of things. Questions for Governor Ritter? Go ahead, Richard.
Hi, Bill.
Introduce yourself so he knows who's talking.
It's Richard Alper. You came taught me my class once at CSU. You said that we keep losing compact litigation. Is that mostly because we're a headwater state and the courts regard us as the resource and the other guys are asking for what we have?
Well, I do think it's because we're a headwater state. I think it's because we did not have great science, Richard, when we were putting those compacts together. We didn't have great science about the amount of water that was really available. Plus, I don't think we had predicted the kind of growth we might have. If you think about the Arkansas River Compact, it was before we were selling water off of the Arkansas River in Otero and Crowley County into municipal, growing municipalities in the Denver metro area. So that's not a surprise to me that we lost that particular piece of litigation, because there was so much at the time of the compact that we really did not have the ability to predict. So I think that's the biggest part of it. And, and you think about Kansas, okay, that's who we're in litigation with on the Arkansas River. If Kansas doesn't have access to that water, if it runs into Kansas dry, the river does, that could be a real big problem for irrigators in Kansas. And so as long as I think people looked at the water we had promised under the compact to deliver and felt that it was reasonable for Kansas to expect that amount of water at the time that we created the compact, I think that's the reason. And I have to tell you, we'll have to renegotiate the Colorado River, but the reason my head of natural resources said do not get into litigation is because we would have lost. We way overestimated the amount of water that was going to flow out of Colorado into the Colorado River over the lifetime of the river.
And Governor, couldn't you also say that part of the issue was that we had not made the connection with respect to the wells and how they were connected to the river, both on the Arkansas and Republican?
Yeah, so that's not just the Arkansas, that's all over the state. I think we learned so much about the hydrology, and really the Supreme Court's first take on that was 2004. So that's really late in the game if you think about a state becoming a state in 1876, that, all of those years later, finally the Supreme Court says, okay, by the way, if you're a well and you're impacting the riparian flow, then we have to have you part of this permitted system. People had operated for years and years without having any requirement of permitting their wells. And it came as kind of a shock to the system, really a shock in places like the San Luis Valley. And it has two aquifers. It has a impermeable and a permeable aquifer, but the pressure in the impermeable is really impacted by the permeable aquifer, how much it fills back up. And so permitting wells down there has been a really difficult thing for farmers because neighbors are impacting neighbors in ways that we're now finding because we know so much more about hydrology. It's really fascinating that it happened sort of later to us as like this late as a state, but it is certainly a part of the problem. You're right.
I have a question, Governor Ritter. This is Carol Dollard from CSU. First a comment, in South Park, we found out we had a CSU campus that had an unpermitted well down in South Park. So for a long time, that's now been fixed.
I assume so.
How we landscape in Colorado is probably a big part of the issue, but how do you see reuse water, reclaimed water playing into this? Is that a big factor?
Yeah, and guess who taught me about reuse water as governor? Carol Dollard. We had I don't know how many of you know it, but there were real restrictions on your ability to capture water and to reuse water, in part because of the prior appropriation system. So we had, and it was a pilot project, right, Carol? It was not something that came through statute where we were using gray water to irrigate the lawns at Colorado State University that were the intramural sports fields. And, that was, I think, one of the first big kind of reuse projects. But, the state of Aurora, while I was governor, they built a reuse project where they had a right to water that they'd purchased. Their users used it, and then it went through Denver's treatment plant. So it went through Denver's treatment plant and then into the South Platte. And what they did was say, well, we have a right to that water. We're basically treating it and letting it go. So as long as we don't impact junior appropriators, we can pick that water up and take it back, pipe it, and reuse it. So it's a 35-mile pipeline from somewhere just north of Brighton that goes back into the Aurora system. And it's called the Prairie something. Do you know what it is, Carol? But it's a big part of sort of us solving this is reuse, and what we also called and still do shared use, where we think about when other users may not actually use water and we can share it, or we can treat water and then after we've treated it, allow somebody else to use it and buy part of that right or share that right with us. So that's, I'd say it's a really big part of it. We had a demonstration piece of legislation that allowed us to demo that you could capture water in cisterns that was rainwater, because when I became governor, it was illegal to have a cistern that captured water, because the belief was that that impacted downstream users, because that water wasn't becoming part of the return flow. So we tested it in Douglas County. It tested well, meaning nobody could really determine that when somebody was capturing water in a cistern, there were measurable gallons of water that were other people were deprived of. And so now we passed a law following on that, and there are cisterns that are permitted in Colorado to capture water. That wasn't true 20 years ago. So there are different things around the technology side to this that we can do on the reuse, the capture, as part of our water plan, but it's not kind of the biggest thing.
Questions? Go ahead. Right.
Hi, Governor, I'm Brian Hayes from City of Loveland, and I just had a quick question on the Colorado River Compact in California. It seems like articles I've been reading lately, one of their defenses in California is prior appropriation. So how can you mess with prior appropriation? And so when I read that, I think, oh, now I'm kind of, swaying the other way. I feel sorry for those guys. But what's the strategy to kind of combat that defense, if any, on Colorado's side, to say, well, yeah, it's prior appropriation, but then, like you said, we over allocated. But it seems like a strong argument, because how can you go against prior appropriation?
Well, so our state has a prior appropriation doctrine that's just about people inside the state and where they fall in the appropriation. So California's saying that's part of the interstate compact, is that there are appropriated users along that. And so I think the other states are saying we're going to renegotiate that compact. That compact is a 100-year-old compact. And I think the argument winds up being what the consequences are if you allow a state that grew to 40 million people, and it's not the whole state that used the Colorado River. It really is the southern part of the state, but I think the city of Los Angeles is 12 or 13 million people. And that's, much, 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 much bigger than it was before. I don't think, that's a fair prior appropriations argument when you're renegotiating a compact. And what's going to happen, so if California can argue that, but if the federal government doesn't agree that California has that entitlement, then they'll have their own compact, and that's what's going to, I think, ultimately be litigated, and it'll be sort of how the courts ultimately view it. So I did see that. That's why they said they did not sign on to the document that Nevada and Arizona signed on for the lower basin states, that they had prior appropriated rights that were not being accorded or accounted for. And courts are ultimately going to decide that, but I don't think it's a great argument with the kind of the level of growth and the number of things that were not anticipated, where California probably does have, a fairly strong argument, and it's the amount of food and, agricultural products that come out of, like I said, the Imperial Valley. That's a strong, strong argument that will, I think, probably make it difficult for us not to tighten our belts more and have their belts tightened a little less. A lot of what we grow in Colorado along the Colorado River is alfalfa. It is, if you take an acre of potatoes and an acre of hay, you have to irrigate an acre of hay 4x what you irrigate an acre of potatoes. And, alfalfa can be a pretty significant cash crop fed to animals, horses, cattle. But that is not the same kind of argument that the Imperial Valley will make about the kinds of food that it grows there and the millions of people it supports.
Thank you.
And Governor, if I could clarify, Brian, too.
Yeah.
California talks about prior appropriation, but in reality, there's a federal statute out there that says California is senior to the Central Arizona project. So as Governor talked about, this may take federal legislation to fix.
So the Central Arizona project pulls water. correct me if I'm wrong about this, but doesn't it pull water out of Lake Mead or Lake Powell and delivers it to Arizona? There's a utility in Arizona called the Salt River Project that's a product of and it's a electric utility, but it also is a water utility. And it was a creation of the Central Arizona Project. But I see what you're saying. So they're saying they're senior to the Central Arizona Project and can't be, uh, they have a prior appropriation right. I think this is going to be settled by courts ultimately, because if the scarcity does not change, it feels to me like there's not a path forward to really mediate or arbitrate a settlement here.
Other questions? Richard?
I thought I read a California Supreme Court case that said that they have a hybrid out there of riparian rights and prior appropriation rights. And I thought some of the time the riparian side wins over the prior appropriation stuff. And so I don't know whether their hybrid approach out there weakens their argument about prior appropriation as an interstate thing that gives them more strength.
Yeah, and it's so I took water law in law school and then had to learn it again as governor, but that's an interstate issue for the state of California. I don't think it impacts their compact obligations, and so uh, so a riparian state is another way that a state decides how water is allocated, and so I think I remember that they had a hybrid system, but I don't believe that in any way impacts their compact allegations under the Colorado River.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, Governor Ritter, I'm Dave Thorpe with Hartford Homes. This is an odd question. Is there any conversation about Colorado's ability to fulfill our headwaters requirement due to climate change and the polluters being required to offset our inability to deliver?
That's a great question. That's actually a great question, but the answer is no. I have not heard any kind of a conversation about that, but it's sort of a fascinating question. I mean, part of the problem is you can't make it rain, right? And that's, if you're a headwater state, you can't find ways for there to be more water, even if you had the resources to sort of pay for it. But it would not, I mean, right now, the area of Grand Junction is already considered a hotspot, meaning it's already reached its 4 degree Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius average temperature increase. So when we say, we want to hold it to 2 degrees Celsius, we mean average over the globe and average in places, but we've already experienced around the globe hotspots that have increased to the point where they're beyond what the average is that we're trying to hold. Grand Junction is one of them. So imagine if you do have polluters who you can prove actually caused this, but even in some cases knew that they might cause it, and they were required to pay resources into a bucket. I've never heard anything of this conversation. There are lawsuits where people are trying to get, particularly I'd say the biggest oil and gas operations, to pay, and there's evidence in some cases that some of their scientists predicted that it would come, and they didn't do anything about sort of publishing that or telling their shareholders. Whether they ultimately wind up in litigation or with any new liabilities is an open question, but I just think your question is a pretty interesting one.
Yeah, California will give you your water if you stop sending us CO2.
I think, I think one of the things we should also put on the table, and I don't know how real it is, but there are other places where the West could pull water from. It's kind of funny, the Michigan governor, when I was governor, who's now the Secretary of Energy, she was very concerned that we were going to come after the Great Lakes. The Mississippi is in some serious dire straits as well right now. There was a time where people were thinking maybe we should, there's a lot of flooding along the Missouri in North Dakota, South Dakota, and maybe we should think about a pipeline that comes into the Front Range. There's no, I've not heard anything more concrete than just people talking through what that would mean from, you know, an engineering standpoint and how much it might cost. But it's not out of the realm of possibilities that that could someday, you know, grow legs.
Good question. Go ahead, Brian.
I know you went to both CSU and CU. There's a big game on September 16th. Are you a Buff or a Ram?
So I used to, when I was governor, I used to say I was agnostic, that I, you know, have degrees in both schools. But the very first year I was there, my son was at CSU at the time as well. He was getting a degree in the Warner College of Natural Resources. And so they tied at the end of the game, and it said overtime. That was that California overtime. I think they still have it for college, where each team gets the ball on the 20. And our quarterback, CSU, when I say our, CSU's quarterback was Bradley Van Pelt, and he threw an interception into the end zone. And I was down on the field because I give the trophy to the winning team as governor. And I went, no, like that. And it was apparent right then that I had a team, that I was not agnostic, and a bunch of radio and TV people who had asked me that question had basically seen it and filmed it and said, well, he's not an agnostic, he's a CSU fan. So I am probably, and now I've been at CSU for 12 years, as Carol knows. So I've been over 12 years there. I'm all Ram now. But what a pickup for the coach at CU. That's going to be interesting.
Well, Governor, I think we're out of questions. Thank
Okay.
you so much for joining us again this year, and we wish you good luck and look forward to seeing you next year.
Well, thanks. I'm sorry I wasn't with you, but good to meet you all virtually, and thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Question, it's like, okay, who signed your paycheck?
Next.
But actually.
Oh, yeah, you could go to any of these garbage.
Next session, we have a couple of things. Next session is going to be a lot, is focused on food litter. So you're gonna hear about who runs through it, you know, you're gonna hear all those different aspects of it and groups with it. So that's a heads up. What struck you most for this session? What kind of made you go, oh?
I think that if we would have had time for more questions, I would have asked the governor what kind of political dynamics are going to play out in the next few years, because I'd love to be in that room when it's real quiet at first, and everyone knows there's tension, there's all this precedent legally, and all these issues. It's 7 governors and 14 senators and maybe another bit of congressional delegation in there. My question is, when does this spill over into it outside of the 7 type of issue? If he talks about federal legislation, well, now you got to see how skillful you are as a politician to win friends who, you know, whatever body of Congress you happen to be in, if you're going to start pushing legislation federally.
That was always our fear on the Colorado River. People who negotiated on it is, we all worked for governors, but we kept it at a low level. And so the big T politics, the red and blue politics did not get involved. This is getting so dire that that's the fear right now. When I talk to negotiators in all of their states, when our governor said he wanted to move our commissioner, Becky Mitchell, over to work full time on the Colorado River, most people thought, oh, good, because she can spend all her time on that. The other half of us said, oh my God, now she's hooked right to the governor. You know, and is that going to start, you know?
You mean turning it too political instead of professional?
Yeah, and so that's the fear. When Governor Ritter talks about renegotiating the compact, what he means is negotiating a new set of guidelines. I don't think the compact can be renegotiated. There's just too many practical hurdles to that. And it is our underlying protection overall if we have to go to court. If we go to court, we're talking 10 years, we're talking a decade. before that gets resolved. And as you know, Mother Nature isn't giving us a decade. And so these folks are under a lot of pressure now to figure out what we can work with. Yeah, Richard.
So negotiating over guidelines on a 100-year-old compact means, you'll know better than I, like details of the mechanisms and the reporting and, but not big picture-y things like allocations.
It is big picture things, like allocations. When the first guidelines set these levels at the two reservoirs, and at certain levels, you would have what was called declaring a shortage, which just happened 2 years ago. And so what we found though was those levels were too high. And so the drought contingency plans, which I think Benton gave you a fact sheet on the drought contingency plans, set those guidelines even lower. They're still not lower. So that is the conversation is allocations essentially, mostly for the lower basin because the upper basin takes a hit. And quite honestly, we only use 350 to 450,000 acre feet a year. And that's a lot less than California. So I know it's snowing. I know you're anxious to go. I'll let you go. Thank you so much. Our veteran will be in your mailbox.
Yes. Send me your homework by Monday, please. I will send an email out as always.
My
Safe travel.
Yeah,
you too.
And all presentations will be on the website as always,
And you're just like.
including the footage.
Yeah.